Perfect. Okay, thank you so much. And I just wanted to, like everyone, thank the organizers for this wonderful symposium, especially Paul Denis and Carl Knappett for the invitation. It's an honor to be here today speaking to you about one of my favorite topics in one of my favorite places. Yes, I came from Alaska, but I grew up in Mississauga, so it does feel like coming home. I'm very excited to be able to speak about ancient Aegean miniatures today, specifically the miniatures that you can see on the screen right now. These are small-scale votive figurines from the Minoan peak sanctuary of Petsophas. And don't worry, I will break down that statement shortly so that it makes sense. These tiny figurines, just a few centimeters high, could easily be overlooked in the Aegean Gallery on the third floor of the museum. Amidst display cases of more monumental Cypriot votive statues, large sarcophagi like we just heard about, or later Greek amphorae, no one would blame you for walking past these humble objects amidst the grandeur. But please stop and turn around and go take a look, because these figurines are unique, very significant to the study of Minoan religion, and quite frankly, just an awesome addition to the collection here in Toronto. To understand their full backstory, why they're here and how they came to be in Toronto, we need to go back to this man right here, Charles Currelly, the first director of the Royal Ontario Museum, or the Royal Ontario Museum of Archaeology, as it was known in 1907. Prior to this appointment, however, Currelly had been traveling the world working at various archaeological projects. About 5 years prior to his museum directorship, he had impressed the famous Egyptologist Flinders Petrie and worked with him for a number of years at various sites in Egypt. But his interest in archaeological connections eventually brought him to Crete, where Richard Dawkins and Robert Bosanquet were excavating a Bronze Age settlement on the east coast of the island. The site was known as Rousselakis, or more commonly today, as we heard from Carl, Palekastro, and is one of the oldest excavation projects of the British School at Athens. You can see its location here in the far east of Crete. And the photograph on the right shows the three gentlemen taking a break from their work, looking a lot different from most archaeologists today. Those shirts would never be that white or clean today. Rising behind the ancient town of Rousselakis is a 270-meter hill known as Petsophas, and it was revealed in the course of this early 20th century excavation project that the hill had been the location of a Bronze Age sanctuary. You might remember that the Ram's figurines shown in the first slide were votive objects from Petsophas, and it was objects just like these that early excavations revealed. The excerpt at the top of this screen is from the 1903 excavation report, in which Bosanquet describes the work of his colleague John Myers in uncovering what we now call a Minoan peak sanctuary, complete with thousands of human and animal figurines. I'd like to point out that such prehistoric sites and artifacts were often described as primitive or crude in these early days of archaeology. The terminology reflects the linear biased thinking of the largely European excavators. In truth, the site and its objects are anything but. This quote from the report is also notable for its mention of one Mr. Currelly, who, as Bosanquet writes, doubled the bag of votive objects when Mr. Myers needed to return to England before the completion of that summer's dig season. Indeed, Toronto's Charles Currelly was actually one of the earliest excavators of the Minoan site of Petsophas. Petsophas was the first Minoan peak sanctuary to be identified, but it was far from the only. The discoveries atop Petsophas inspired Arthur Evans, who we heard about earlier, already conducting large-scale excavations at Knossos, to investigate the peak of Mount Euctus, the much larger 720-meter high peak, which rises south of the palace at Knossos. There, he too found thousands of small-scale terracotta figurines, pottery, offerings, and even terrace walls, often thrown into natural rock crevices at the peak. Over time, other peaks proved to be similar types of sites, with miniature votives left, presumably as offerings, between rocky fissures and on man-made terraces. All of these peak sanctuaries were located on elevated peaks or ridges with a view to the landscape below, were often in view of a nearby Bronze Age settlement or palace, and were often within a day's walk of that associated town. But what were the purposes of such sites? What were the ancient visitors to such sanctuaries doing, and how do we know they were sanctuaries at all? Well, to answer this, we must turn to the artifacts themselves. The miniature objects from the peak sanctuary of Mount Euctus provide us with the largest collection of such artifacts, and here you can see some of these amazing pieces as they are displayed today in the Heraklion Archaeological Museum on Crete. Many of these votives are human figurines, or at least fragments of the human body, clearly identified as male and female according to dress and anatomy. Minoan women wore large flounced skirts made obvious in these figurines, and open bodices denoted by their prominently molded breasts. Men wore less clothing, usually just a loincloth or a codpiece, and were usually portrayed with small waists and broad shoulders. Another aspect of the human figurines which may strike the viewer is the variety of gestures that the figures demonstrate, and the similarities between many of these gestures across objects and sites. Men are often shown with both hands held in front of their chests, crossed in front of their chests, or with one arm outstretched beside them. Women also often hold their hands in front of their chests in that same manner, while other times holding their hands up to either side of their head, or one arm over their belly and one across their chest. Some of these gestures mimic those seen in other media of Minoan art, suggesting that their meanings were known iconographically and would have been recognized by ancient viewers, even if those meanings have relatively been lost today. Despite these similarities, peak sanctuaries and their assemblages also show a striking lack of uniformity and a high degree of regionalism. You notice the slightly different stylings of these human figurines from Petsophas as they are displayed upstairs here in the ROM. The heads of the females, for instance, don circular headdresses that are not unknown from other peak sanctuary votives, but are also not completely standard. You can see them here. There is evidently not any one artistic style for the figurines of all peak sanctuaries, let alone at a single site's assemblage, and their type and style of manufacture differs across the island. Because of this diversity, it has been suggested that these figurines may have been made by individual worshippers, then brought to these sacred sites as representations of themselves. But further research is needed, and figurine studies continues to be a growing field in Aegean archaeology. The assemblage of votives from Petsophas here in the ROM is a robust example of a sampling of peak sanctuary material. And in addition to some fantastic human torsos, heads, and limbs, animal figurines are also included. Tiny clay representations of bovines, ovines, birds, and weasels are particularly common in peak sanctuary assemblages, representing the species and types of wildlife common in Crete. Here are some other similar figurines from other peak sanctuary sites, and my favorites are always the weasels. They're so cute. Look at them. So cool. Sometimes we see interesting patterns in the particular types of votives deposited at one site. So here, for instance, is an assemblage from the sanctuary of Piscocefalo, and it includes an unusual assortment of rhinoceros beetle figurines. That's what these things are. These are unusual as Minoan animal figurines in general, but their large quantity at this one site is even more peculiar. It is possible that such concentrations of particular forms denote a particular function or meaning of that sanctuary, but such implications are difficult to parse archaeologically. Although animal and human figurines make up the majority of miniaturized object types at peak sanctuaries, objects are also sometimes present themselves. Just like the diversity of human and animal forms, a variety of miniature objects appear and do not seem to follow any particular pattern, at least that we can currently identify. So one of the most famous examples of a small-scale object or model is the boat, seen here from the peak sanctuary of Traustelos. It is also interesting that the votive assemblage at Traustelos is notable for its large number of individual human limbs and its famous figurine of a seated woman with an enlarged leg right here. And these patterns have suggested that perhaps Trestles served as a healing sanctuary, where votive limbs and representations of illnesses and diseases were left as material prayers for worshippers' well-being. A final aspect of this votive assemblage that can be seen here are miniature vessels, right here and here. Pottery is a very common element of peak sanctuaries, but miniature pots are also not unfamiliar to these sites, including at Petsophas. Although none are on display here at the ROM, we know that some of these were found at the peak sanctuary of Polykestro because they were included in a publication of Petsophas material from 1991. You'll remember that the ROM's Mr. Currelly took over for Mr. Myers at the end of the 1903 dig season because Myers needed to return back to Oxford. Well, that hurried finish to the season and a lack of further excavations in the future has led to an overall incomplete study of the Petsophas material. So at present, there is more Petsophas material in museum storage in Greece, just waiting to be examined, and further opportunities for excavation at the peak when we have the opportune time. Fortunately, we do have plans to begin a study on that legacy material, as we heard about earlier, this summer under the direction of Christine Morris and Alan Peatfield, which will hopefully lead to some exciting results and more publication of the fantastic Petsophas material. Now, I love figurines, but my true love is miniature pottery, and they are a fascinating and important part of peak sanctuary votive assemblages. So I would be remiss not to mention them in a discussion of Petsophas material. Interestingly, however, these tiny pots are not just restricted to peak sanctuaries, but show up in settlements, deposits, urban shrines, and palaces. Miniatures are everywhere. This miniature pot, for example, is one of my favorites ever, not just because I was there when it was discovered, which was awesome, but also because of how beautifully made and carefully placed it was. These photos are from the more recent excavations at Polykestro, the Palette Project, which was recently run by Carl Knappett, and which I was fortunate enough to have been a part of for many years. Just 2.8 centimeters high and 3.1 centimeters wide, this tiny pot was found carefully placed at the base of a wall during its construction over top of the earlier wall below it, running here. An intentional niche, such as this one, with material placed inside, is called a foundation deposit and is usually interpreted as a demarcated space set aside from its surroundings to denote its sacred or special nature. Often then material is placed inside to be part of that special space. And although it's difficult to know for sure, in the case of Bronze Age remains, foundation deposits are usually interpreted as religious or at least spiritual or supernatural features, their presence denoting a meaning beyond the functionality of construction. So why miniatures? Why did the Minoans feel the need to make these objects and representations at such a small scale? What meaning did they hold? Well, to investigate these questions, my research looked specifically at miniature pottery found at Minoan sites from, and maybe now you're a little more familiar with the Aegean chronology, Middle Minoan 1b to Late Minoan 1b, which really just means approximately 1900 to 1450 BCE, or 3.5 to 4,000 years ago. My doctoral research looked at material from 13 different sites in Central and East Crete, and in order to understand what these objects were doing in non-ritual environments, I actually focused on settlement sites. What I found was that these miniature pots could be slotted into two different types, what I call small miniatures, those on the right, or those that are diminished versions of their prototypes, but are still large enough to serve practical uses in daily life, similar to those of the originals. Or what I call micro-miniatures, or those too small to be useful in any practical sense. Despite the long-standing assumption that exists in Aegean archaeology that all miniature pottery served ritual functions, I argue that micro-miniatures held inherent cultic connotations while small miniatures were more fluid in their uses, sometimes incorporated into ritual environments or activities to be used as cultic material, while in other situations, simply serving as small containers in non-ceremonial spaces. This helps to explain why miniatures appear in all kinds of contexts, but that it was the micro-miniatures that held sacred meaning. But why miniaturize at all? I mean, in many material cultures, sacred art and objects are made at the opposite extreme of scale manipulation. I think we're all more familiar with the monumentalization, which is sometimes used to emphasize the grandeur of the divine. Minoan art, however, actually does just the opposite. It seems that the prehistoric people of Crete were well versed in the language of the miniature. The finest examples of their craftsmanship were rendered at the most minute scale. We already saw a few examples of these, such as the amazing seal found just a few years ago on the mainland near Pylos. Another amazing example is the so-called Ring of Minos over here. And this is an intricately carved gold ring, less than 2 inches in width, yet it portrays numerous human figures amidst a detailed environment, which includes trees, water, a boat, and Minoan architecture. Another famous example is the Malia bee pendant seen in the center here. This is nearly 4,000 years old and is 4.5 centimeters in width, and is comprised of tiny pieces of granulated gold. It's truly amazing to see. Even Minoan wall painting was sometimes done in a miniature style, like the so-called grandstand fresco from the Palace of Knossos. It's difficult to get a sense of scale or, even orientation at what you're looking at here, but this is a wall fresco that measures 54 centimeters high, and you can see a detail here. There's dozens of figures in this miniaturized fresco. So there's no denying the Minoan fascination with the small scale, and theoretically, there is good reason for that. Humans, it seems, are drawn to the miniature and always have been. Many people have written and theorized about this phenomenon, so I thought I would share some of the highlights of miniaturization theory. I won't get bogged down in the nerdiness, but just a few interesting quotes that I'll leave you to think about. And I guarantee you'll never look at a dollhouse or a modeled train set the same way. So in his 1958 work, The Poetics of Space, Gaston Bachelard acknowledged the powerful paradox of miniatures, writing that although the size of an object may be diminished, this actually increases its meaning and affect. As material is minimized, meaning is concentrated, and values become condensed and enriched in miniature. In 1962, Claude Lévi-Strauss noted that miniaturization affords the individual the ability to see and gain a preliminary knowledge of something in its entirety before understanding its more complex details. So an object becomes easier to approach because it's qualitatively simplified. A couple of decades later, the literary critic, Susan Stewart, discussed how the tiny can inspire wonder and freeze time and space. In fact, Stewart suggests that miniatures exist in their own system of time, a vortex which the viewer can temporarily enter through the unique affordances of miniatures. Quote, "The reduction in scale which the miniature presents skews the time and space relations of the everyday life world." Stewart's observations found corroboration in the studies of Alton DeLong, whose really interesting experiments in the 1980s supported a direct connection between reduced scale and temporal compression. So he asked participants to move miniature figures through models of rooms of various sizes as they were placed in front of them. And each participant was then asked to inform the investigator when they felt that half an hour had passed. The study found that the smaller the scale of the model, the quicker the participant believed the 30 minutes to have gone by. A second experiment yielded similarly fascinating results. He asked people to play versions of the game Pong at various sizes and found that time as experienced by the players seemed to compress proportional to the diminished size of the game. You may have experienced something similar if you visited places such as Little Canada here in Toronto, Or pilgrims experience this in the Ave Maria Grotto in Alabama. Visitors often feel that their sense of time and even meditation is heightened or their time is reduced while at these places. Douglas Bailey notes that this temporal compression is one of many paradoxes of miniature, another being its ability to both empower and confront the spectator. So by allowing the viewer to gain knowledge of the whole and thus put them at ease, a small-scale object also kind of unsettles the viewer, makes you feel a little bit weird. And finally, this confusion has been termed by Jack Davey as miniature dissonance, in that a miniature imitates another object but doesn't actually become it. So in many ways, miniatures have these paradoxes that help to heighten our engagement with them. Many of these ideas fit nicely with two cognitive theories of material interaction. Andy Clark has suggested that the human brain is primed to utilize alternatives when physical forms do not exist or are absent. He calls these surrogates and posits that surrogates work most effectively when they suppress concrete detail in order to highlight key features. This sounds a lot like aspects of miniatures. In a similar vein, Matthew Day suggests that material culture plays an important role in aiding human cognition. Offline cognition is the way in which living things think about absent or non-existent objects or concepts. Religion is one of the most prominent examples in humans. So Day suggests that material culture allows the brain to offload activity to materials, and in this way, they become part of the cognitive process and allow the human mind to transform abstract concepts into more palatable material forms. And this can be the case for any kind of object, but miniatures specifically, pots, figurines, tiny models, seem particularly powerful materials through which to think, act, and develop these cognitive responses. So miniaturization as a material phenomenon seems especially useful for human engagement with the divine and processing of the ineffable. But this concept seems very applicable to what we know about Minoan religion and spirituality itself, particularly this emphasis on individualism and diversity seen in the miniature votive objects of Bronze Age Crete. Although visual and textual evidence makes it clear that multiple deities, mostly female, were worshipped in Bronze Age Crete, there's a general lack of consistency in religious iconography. It is, for instance, very difficult to identify images of either rulers or goddesses, gods, and other deities in Minoan art. Seated women, often enthroned on elevated platforms, like over here or here, and floating figures, seemingly descending from the sky, seem to be strong candidates for representations of supernatural beings, but iconographic studies have identified few consistencies among them. Unlike later classical Greek deities you may be familiar with, no divine attributes could potentially help to assign identities to iconographic representations of Minoan deities. But perhaps the Minoans did not necessarily need visual representations to engage with the divine. Perhaps it was more communing with the divine, which was more significant for them than creating an image. And it was through their individualized figurines and small-scale objects that they could find this personal communion. Miniatures, with their abstraction and compression, may have facilitated that engagement. So I suggest that Minoan miniatures, from the miniature pots of Polycastro to the human figurines of Petsophas on display upstairs, served as cognitive tools, assisting worshippers in the creation of a personalized form of religion. For as Mark Morris writes, the small conjures up infinity more easily than the large. So while these tiny figurines 3 floors up may not immediately elicit the awe and wonder of grander objects in the Aegean gallery, they are immensely significant in their own right. Peak sanctuary votives are an important part of Bronze Age Crete's fascinating story, Petsophas' assemblage not least of these. Each one of these objects is the product of hopes, prayers, and devotion manifested in clay. I suggest you take pause to admire the Minoan mastery of miniatures and appreciate these humble offerings. Thank you so much for your attention, and my sincere thanks to everyone listed here who helped make this research possible. I would be happy to answer any questions. Thank you.